I recently read an article in Forbes by Brian Portnoy called "Diversification Means Always Having to Say You're Sorry." The math of diversification makes sense. It's the psychology of diversification that's muddled. Diversification is the anchor to designing an effective portfolio of investments. In Harry Markowitz's paper on modern portfolio theory, he expressed the idea that it's common sense to all of us. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Very simple. Because we don't know what's going to outperform, we spread our bets across a variety of investments. Doing so allows us to hold a more efficient portfolio, meaning for the same level of risk, we earn higher returns, or two, we can achieve a similar return level but at reduced volatility. Sounds good. But of course there's a catch, and one that few have actually commented on. Being truly diversified means there's almost always going to be a part of your portfolio that's doing badly. So what's the big deal if owning underperformers is built into the definition? While this is true, we forget the psychological aspect. We hate owning losers, and we fixate on the negative, drumming up feelings of regret and if only, or if my advisor had tilted to more towards, well, you fill in the blank. Two things are clear. One, a diversified portfolio will often have outright losers in it, and two, the gap between the top performer and the bottom loser is often very wide. The opportunity to feel regret is frequent, which means diversification usually doesn't feel very good. It doesn't mean it's not working, it just means we're not emotionally equipped to handle the losers. Last year stands as a great example. Take our typical growth portfolio versus the S&P 500. Last year, 2014, it only produced about a 1% return. The problem is that the S&P, by far the most popular index for the market, returned more than 13% in 2014. That gap left many investors with a sense of frustration over their portfolios. It doesn't mean diversification failed, it just means one sector did better, although a very popular one. So what causes this in us? Well, I'd like to point to three behavioral quirks: loss aversion, the fallacy of composition, and if-only bias. So what's loss aversion? Loss aversion states that the pain we feel with losses is disproportionately large compared to the joy we feel with gains. A standard example is to compare a $100 loss versus a $100 gain. According to many studies, even though the loss and gain are the same amount, we find the loss much more aggravating than we find the gain enjoyable. Scientists often point to about a 2-to-1 ratio, meaning that we need to win $200 to feel enough happiness to offset the annoyance of losing $100. Because we just showed that there are always losers in a portfolio, at least in a relative sense, but also in an absolute sense, we're stuck with the pain of knowing that something's not working. A pain that often overwhelms the fact that plenty of other pieces are working just fine and as we want to. This is exactly why we built the diversified portfolio. The whole eggs in a basket argument and the inability to know what will outperform tomorrow. But that's where the second bias comes in. Our general tendency is to focus on pieces of the whole rather than the whole itself. Not only is it easier to focus on one versus many, it's then that much more taxing to take on the relationships between the various pieces. When given transparency, we're not wired to see the one portfolio. We're wired to see the individual investments that comprise it. This is where the fallacy of composition kicks in, a bias in which we reflexively assign the attributes of one piece to the whole. So if we apply that to our portfolios, if something's not working right now and perhaps losing a lot of money, then the portfolio overall is flawed, even broken. Let's try a silly example. Let's say we have a portfolio that's 98% in U.S. Treasuries, 2% in equities or stocks. You know the proportion, but as an advisor I show you a portfolio with only two items. Assuming the bonds muddle along but the stock's exposure is extremely volatile and it's down 40%, you're likely going to tell me, I built a risky portfolio. That's clearly not the case. Down 40%, the equity exposure cost you 0.8 cents on the dollar. If the Frontier Fund goes to zero, you would have lost just 2 cents on the dollar. That's why it's difficult to see the portfolios which are actually on track to meet your financial goals, and they're perceived as a failure. Finally, there's the phenomenon of if only. The science of regret is complex, but a key takeaway is that how we initially benchmark success will be a key determinant of happiness. In our portfolios, if we measure our success by comparing all the investments to the top performer at the time, then we're doomed to be displeased. It's a fact of nature to feel recently that if only more of my assets were invested in the S&P index fund. That mindset of chasing recent performance is a sure ticket to not meeting one's long-term financial objectives. Woulda, shoulda, coulda is not a strategy worth pursuing. Ultimately, the math of diversification makes sense. It's the psychology of diversification that is muddled. The path forward is not to rethink the former, but to accept and think through the latter. It's not a smart alternative to concentrate one's portfolio in what one predicts will be the hot sector. At the same time, it's also unfair to ourselves to ignore that diversification is often a very bitter pill to swallow, even when it's good for us. So until the next time, go out and lead an abundant life.